Belzer and Thom Hartmann to the stand. A bunch of fucking hippies. I want to thank the Academy. Oh, it's the wrong. Oh, Thom Hartmann. I'm sorry. Actually, when Thom asked me to do this, I was more than flattered. Very few radio personalities educate on a daily basis, but none to the degree that Thom does. For 3 hours a day, this guy, this man, gives a master class in what's going on in this country. He puts it in perspective. He fearlessly and gentlemanly debates people on the other side. I think it's the only venue where there's civil discussion, no name-calling on Thom's part, and he is certainly one of the most gracious men that I've ever heard or met. I had the good fortune to meet him recently, last year. I think we had lunch in New York, and I was spellbound. It was like being with Robert De Niro or one of my other show business idols, which I have very few of. I think Thom Hartmann's name is so appropriate. The doubting Thomas who has a heart. That's what Thom Hartmann is. Not only does he doubt, he educates us on why we should doubt and what questions we should ask. Thom is in part responsible for me writing for the Huffington Post, because he gets me so inspired and so riled up. And how many dinner parties can I, make people glaze over at? So I'm being coy, but I'm a fascinating dinner guest, as you might suspect. But I can't really say enough about Thom. I'm rarely inarticulate, but I genuinely believe that. How you doing, buddy? Nice to see you. I genuinely believe that, and I'm going to talk, I just thought of this on the way over here, and I'm going to talk to Thom about it. I'm going to spring it on him now. I think that his show should be taught in universities. I think certain classes could listen, right, don't you think? I mean, there's got to be a way to do that, and I'm going to try to figure it out, even if it's a highlight reel or something that certain universities get, and you listen to the show, then the professor and the students will discuss what he's talking about. Because one thing that's great, many things, but one of the things that's great about Thom is his economy of language, his lack of hyperbole, and his sincerity and his love of this country comes through in such an articulate and sometimes poetic way that I think it's great to see all you people here tonight. And I would just recommend one thing. Keep recommending to your friends and people that you know to tune in Thom at noon and every day, or get him on the internet and buy his books, because there are very few treasures like this in our country, and we should be grateful for him and support him. And again, thank you all for being here tonight, and stay with the fight, okay? Thank you. Thom Hartmann.
Thank you, Richard. I'm honored to be introduced by you, and it's and to know you. Richard is, well, you know Richard, and he's doing some marvelous writing for Huffington Post. First of all, thanks so much to all of you for showing up. I mean, so many people here. You'd think that somebody had announced that we were going to be waterboarding Dick Cheney. Yeah, well, we can hope, So you can hear me back there in the cheap seats? This works? Okay, great. I live on a houseboat in Portland, Oregon, or a house that floats in the river. And about a week after we moved in, 2.5 years ago, I went out on the back dock, which is our backyard, which is like this little floating platform that's attached to the back of the house where we've got some plants and pots. And there was this giant goose out there. And as I walked out on the deck, the goose came right at me, just, like this. And, my first thought was, what? Why? What's this goose trying to say to me? Within a step or two, I figured out that what the goose was saying was, don't leave that house, get back in the, and so I went back in the house. And I thought, okay, he'll be gone in a few hours. He wasn't. The next day he was there. The next day after that he was there. The plants were starting to wilt. I had to get out there and water them. So I went out with a broom the third day. And Gooselini and I, this is the name that a comedian friend of mine, Steve Behrman, Swami Vivekananda, gave to our goose. Gooselini and I had at it, and you know, at least with the broom I could hold him at bay, but he was not giving up. I mean, he was just not giving up, this goose. And I've got a maniacal cat, Higgins. In fact, I've got a button someplace that says Higgins for president. And even Higgins was intimidated by this goose. I mean, this is, I don't know where the button is. Anyway, so the point, and then we had just moved in, and about a week later, I mean, a week went by with this crazed goose on our back porch, and I was trying to figure, you know, what is this? And my first thought was that he'd like flown into a window or something and was crazy. You know, he'd brain damaged goose. And then I thought maybe he was a rabid goose, you know, but I'd never heard of geese getting rabies, and you know, it didn't seem like the goose flew or something. I just didn't know what it was. And as we were getting to know our neighbors, Louise met the woman who lived next to us, Pam, and Pam said that she had a goose on her backyard, in her back porch, on her back deck. And Louise said, "Oh, it must be terrible. The goose won't let you out, right?" And Pam said, "No, it's no problem at all. She just sits on her nest all day long." And all of a sudden we figured out what Gooselini was all about. You know, the Gooselini was the proud papa who was protecting the nest on the next dock over and didn't want to be close enough to draw the predators to the nest, but wanted to stay close enough that, well, you get the whole story. The point of the story is really twofold. One is that story is one of the most powerful ways that we communicate. And the reason I'm telling you, I'm opening with a story, and that I'll be telling you several stories tonight, is because stories are great memory hooks. Whenever you're trying to persuade someone, essentially this book is about the art and science of political persuasion. Whenever you're trying to share some information with somebody, if you can wrap a story around it, the odds are that they'll remember it much, much longer. Story is how, as a culture, we communicate information. It's how we communicate our cultural frames. The second reason is to point out how important communication is. You know, here's a goose communicating with me. I mean, if it's this, and communicating quite effectively. Thank you very much. You know, I got the message. It took a while to figure out the subtleties of it, but I immediately knew what the primary message was. So, story is tremendously important. There are a variety of stories. In fact, stories serve as frames. There are archetypal stories in our culture. If I say, for example, the little boy who yelled wolf, or who cried wolf, you know immediately what I'm talking about. There's a whole complex story there, and you know, instantly you know what it is. And you can even drop somebody into that frame. You know, I could say, for example, yeah, Dick Cheney's talking about Iran again. He's the little boy who cried wolf. And boom, now all of a sudden the frame has defined the content, the comment. So we've wrapped a story to an event like that, the power of story. There's also sort of an anti-power of story. I remember back when our oldest was about 4 years old, 3 or 4 years old. This would have been almost 30 years ago, 29 years ago. And she was, I read her one night, you know, you read your kids' books before they go to bed, and I read her Cinderella. And I'd never actually, as a kid, sat down and read Cinderella all the way through and really thought about it. You know, I mean, we're all exposed to it, and we saw the Disney whatever, you know. But so I read this story to her, and I remember going out in the kitchen and saying to Louise, my wife, afterwards, I think I've just participated in like a 1,000-year-old or 500-year-old, I don't know how old the story is. You know, it goes back to medieval British times, I guess. It's 500-year-old sociological experiment. And she's like, what are you talking about? And I said, well, I just told our daughter a story in which the negative role model girls, the mean, ugly, bad girls, had a goal and were on a mission. They were trying to accomplish something. And the good girl, in quotes, the role model girl, was kind of off in space. She was a space case, you know, she saw pumpkins and mice and, you know, and her job description was maid. M-A-I-D. She was a maid. She cleaned the floors and things. And not only that, what they were competing over, these three girls, what they were competing over was a man. And not just any man, but a guy who was such a putz that he couldn't even remember what she looked like. He could only remember what her feet looked like. We're talking, this is a story about a foot fetishist. And Well, I understand that there are now some new versions of Cinderella out for kids that are less toxic. But what it demonstrates is that we have stories that have been handed down to us over the years that at times have been emblematic of how society was organized, that at times arguably might have been useful. I'm not sure how Cinderella was ever useful, but it probably was, or it wouldn't have survived. And at times we have to sort, we have to filter, determine what are the useful stories and what are the not useful stories, and also look for ways that we can use story in communicating message. And one of the really important things. Some of the stories in the context of politics, arguably the most important story. I was this afternoon after I got off the air. Lionel does a show on Air America before I do, and Lionel and I went around the corner to the bar and had a beer, and we're just talking. And he was talking about how few people actually can quickly and tightly define conservative and liberal. And he said, everybody wants to, well, what's your position on gun control? What do you think about abortion? What do you think about Bill of Rights? What do you think? He says, isn't the First Amendment pretty conservative? No, maybe it's liberal. I don't know. And Lionel, he's brilliant and he's funny and he's just going through this thing. And I'm like, I can boil it down really simply for you. And it is, and here it is. Conservatives believe, and this is, by the way, true. I mean, these are the essential stories that go back to the founding of this country and really to the founding of Western civilization in many ways, and not just Western civilization, also Eastern. I mean, you find similar things replicated all around the world. Conservatives believe that people are essentially evil at their core. If you were to survey the vast majority of people, you'd find that more than half of them were evil, and liberals believe that the majority of people are good. And everything flows out of that. These core stories were laid out during the Enlightenment, the 1600s. In the early 1600s, 1634, Thomas Hobbes wrote Leviathan, this brilliant tome that became the foundation both of conservative and of liberal thought. It became the foundation of liberal thought in that Hobbes, as the tutor to King, I think it was James II, or would have been James I, whichever, anyway, it was Charles. But in any case, he put forward the idea, which was almost heretical at the time, that people could rule themselves, that you didn't need a divinely ordained king to rule, that the king could participate with Parliament, that there could be the power to the people, as it were. That was the beginning of liberal thought, modern liberal thought, 1634 in Leviathan. He also put forward in Leviathan the beginning of modern conservative thought that was carried forward in the founding of our country by the conservatives of Alexander Hamilton and John Adams, and is carried forward today by modern conservatives, you know their names. And in that he defined humans as essentially evil. In fact, let me just share it with you. It's just a couple of sentences, and it's in the book. This is from Leviathan. This is Hobbes. He said, in such condition, now he's talking about what would life be like if mankind, I mean, this is the phrase that they used back then, if humankind lived in its natural state, that is, without church and state, without rules, without regulation, what would the natural state of humans be? He said, in such condition, without people being ruled by the iron fist of church or king, there is no place for industry, because the fruit thereof is uncertain, and consequently no culture of the earth. No navigation nor use of the commodities that may be imported by sea, no commodious buildings, no instruments of moving and removing such things as require much force, no knowledge on the face of the earth, no account of time, no arts, no letters, no society, and which is worst of all, continual fear and danger of violent death, and the life of man solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. Right? Hobbes' famous quote from Leviathan. And, he really believed that that was the nature of humans and that that's what life would be like without the iron fist of church or state to regulate our evil impulses. Well, that was in 1634. Over the next 20, 30 years, as stories were coming in, and they had been for almost a century at that point, but they were really starting to come in with amazing speed. This was the Enlightenment. The stories were coming in from Africa and from the Americas of people who were having first contact with Aboriginal people. And they were coming back and they were saying, hey, these people have pretty good lives. These aren't the savages that Hobbes talked about. Life for them is not nasty, brutish, and short. You know, they're doing quite well, thank you very much. I mean, there are some places where there's warfare, and yeah, they don't have, you know, modern appliances, whatever the state of the art was in 1635, but, you know, life is good. And so you had philosophers like the French philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who was writing about the noble savage. And John Locke really first carried this idea forward in his second treatise on government, which I recall was around 1654, in the 1650s anywhere, and somewhere in there. And there he flipped it. He said, no, the essential nature of humans is good. And the reason why we can trust ourselves to govern ourselves is because we are good. And I'll just give you a very short quote from Locke, because these are our foundational stories. This is the essential one. Locke wrote in the second treatise on government, he said, man being born has been proved with a perfect title to perfect freedom. Excuse me, with a title to perfect freedom. And an uncontrolled enjoyment, so that was a pretty radical word back then, by the way, of all the rights and privileges of the law of nature, and he italicized law of nature, equally with any other man or any number of men in the world, hath by nature a power, and that was italicized, by nature a power, not only to preserve his property, but his life, liberty, and estate against the injuries and attempts of others. So here's Locke saying, no, this is a natural law. Thomas Jefferson then took that language and created the first liberal nation. And these children of the Enlightenment were quite clear. They called themselves liberal. George Washington said, I hope I shall ever see America at the forefront of liberality. This was the liberal Enlightenment. And they created this liberal nation with this founding document where Jefferson took those words of Locke's from 100 years before Jefferson was born. And instead of life, liberty, and estate, life, liberty, and private property, he wrote life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The first time the word happiness had ever found its way into the founding document of a nation. I mean, this is how strongly these guys believed that it was possible that people could govern themselves and be good, and they could create a good nation, and it could be a positive and useful and helpful thing. So these are these core foundational stories, and they inform a lot of our decisions and decision making. I remember I've done my show from the Republican National Convention. I do it every year from the CPAC, the Conservative Political Action Committee. I have conservatives on my program constantly. I think it's really important that we have these dialogues and that we highlight these differences of worldview. And I remember last January when I was doing the Conservative Political Action Conference, the one where all the Republican presidential candidates got up and talked and all that kind of stuff. And I was doing the radio row, and I was interviewing, 3 hours a day, 5 days for a week of conservatives. And there's a guy, Craig Bannister, and I'm not talking out of school. He, in fact, gave me permission to talk about him about our conversation on the radio. Craig is a very nice guy. He's part owner of a PR firm that books conservatives, and he's booked a lot of people on our show over the years. And I'd never met him, but we'd done business with him for several years. And after the show was over, he came over and sat down to introduce himself, and it was just him and me sitting there talking. A very nice guy. I guess he's in his, I don't know how old. He's much younger than I am, which is saying not much. And very nice guy. And he said, you and I want the same thing. He said, I have children. He said, I want my children to grow up in a world where they have a good education, where the air is pure, where the water is drinkable, where they're not afraid of war, a world of peace, where they have access to health care, where they're free, they're not afraid of the government, they're not afraid of anything. You and I want the same thing for ourselves and for our children. He said, where we differ is in the means to that end. We have different paths to that. We have a different belief about how to get there, but really our goals are the same. And I was like, that was so eloquently said, and it's so true. And this is what I find day after day as I have people on the program with whom I disagree, that ultimately we all want a good America. We all want a good world. We all want a good life for ourselves and our children. It's just this disagreement about how to get there. For example, should we, and again, this gets back to the story of what is America and this power of story. Should we have health care provided for by our government or provided for by corporations? Because really those are the only two choices. There's not some magical entity, there's not a healthcare fairy who shows up or something like that. And so, a conservative would come on the program and say, what, you want a government bureaucrat to make decisions about your health care? And my answer is, what, you want a corporate bureaucrat to make decisions about your health care? Now, here's where it gets interesting. Because a conservative would say, yes, they want a corporate bureaucrat to make those decisions. Why? Because corporations are not moral. They are amoral. They're not immoral. They are amoral. They have a singular morality, and that's profit. So if you believe that the majority of humans are evil, then you believe that an institution that's ruled by the majority of humans, like a democracy, small d democracy, has the potential for evil. And so an amoral institution, one with no morality, would be morally superior to the government. And so you would want that organization to take that responsibility, even though it doesn't seem to be working. I mean, Medicare has a 3% overhead. Most of for-profit health insurance companies have anywhere from a 20 to 30% overhead because they got to pay their CEOs, they got to pay their dividends, their shareholders, and they got to pay for the corporate jets and the gold-plated faucets in the restrooms and the lobbyists and everything else. But nonetheless, they believe in this. It's an issue of morality ultimately. Whereas a liberal would say, no, I believe in democracy. I believe in my government. And I would like to know that, if I don't think that I'm getting good health care, that I can go camp outside my congressman's office and say, hey, and I can organize a protest, and I can run somebody against him or her in the primary if I don't think that they're doing a good job. And every 2 years they have to answer to me in the voting booth or in the ballot box. And this is this fundamental cleavage, because if a corporation is amoral and government is we the people, and we the people are morally positive, are good rather than evil, then government is morally superior to a corporation. And once you get this fundamental difference in story, then all kinds of things start falling into place about these two separate worldviews. And I'm not arguing that one is necessarily better than the other. I mean, obviously I have my own personal bias, but it's not my goal here to absolutely state, to make the case for that. That's another book that I wrote called "Screwed: The Undeclared War Against the Middle Class and What We Can Do About It." But the goal of this book is to share with you the toolkit for communicating story. The first third of the book is about story, and it's about the stories that I just shared with you and how they came about and where they came from and how they came to be. Then to some specific tools. For example, framing. George Lakoff writes about framing in Don't Think About an Elephant and other writings. He's brilliant at it. Framing is reducing a story, and it has to be a story. It's reducing a collection of issues to a story and then reducing the story to a sentence, essentially, like The Little Boy Who Cried Wolf. I mean, it's a very powerful frame. And so you can even reduce it to one word. Freedom, for example. George Bush used the word freedom 27 times in 30 minutes 2 weeks ago. And I'm sorry, 27 times in less than 10 minutes. And never used the word democracy. Why freedom? Well, for a conservative, freedom means taking the power away from government, that corruptible force that's answerable to all these evil people, and handing it to corporate entities, privatization. Whereas to a liberal, or in the American tradition, freedom would mean a certain basis on which we stand in order to be free. Franklin Roosevelt in 1936, January 27, 1936, in Philadelphia, when he was nominated for his second term as president, in his acceptance speech, said, an old English judge once said, a necessitous man is not a free man. If you're hungry, you're not free. If you're homeless, you're not free. If you're afraid that if you lose your job, you'll die because you won't have access to health care, you're not free. And so what Roosevelt set out to do with the New Deal was to create a safety net, a foundation on which we could all stand so that we could be free, so that we could have a measure of freedom and independence. And thus came about those programs that are referred to as the New Deal that have been radically reversed in many cases since 1981, when Reagan first started the reversal of the New Deal, and then Clinton continued it, declaring the era of big government was over, and on from there. But nonetheless, this is framing. So just even the single word freedom has a different meaning depending on the perspective you're coming from. And when you understand that, then you understand how you can go about changing the frame and the subtleties that go into making that frame. Another tool that's used, and this is, hang on just a second. This is a very, very common tool in advertising, I'd say. And in my background, bringing what I'm trying to do here is bring both psychology and marketing into this. And I've worked on the edges of both of those fields. From 1978 to 83, I was the executive director of a residential treatment facility for severely abused and emotionally disturbed kids in New Hampshire, the New England Salem Children's Village. It's still there and doing very well. And was rostered I was listed on the Vermont roster of psychotherapists. And for the better part of almost 2 decades, I worked in 2 different positions as CEO of ad agencies in Atlanta and in Michigan. And I can tell you that this technique called future pacing is a core therapeutic technique, and it's also a core technique used in advertising and marketing. And future pacing involves having a person imagine a future, project them into that future, have them experience that future by giving them some hook, some story, some picture, some sense of that future, and then bringing them back into the present. Now, and if their vicarious experience of the future has been positive, then now back in the present, they view that future as a positive thing, they're more likely to move in that direction. Thus, most advertising is basically future pacing, which is actually the word is a technique that comes out of hypnosis, frankly. And so, for example, my confession tonight share this story with you. It's like anything, you can use these tools, for good or for evil, I guess, in the Hobbesian sense. And this is one that I'm still trying to figure out if I'm proud of it or not. I don't know. So I'll tell you the story. I'll let you decide. This is about 15 years ago, and at the time I was CEO of an ad agency in Atlanta, and I was doing a lot of consulting work with companies. We had our client list was mostly Fortune 500 companies and government agencies, American Express and Sony and CERTA and Scientific Atlanta and the CIA and U.S. military intelligence, and it was a wild and interesting time, and fascinating insights into a lot of worlds that many of which I didn't even realize existed. The way that I had all these stereotypes that were wrong, and I was doing a lot of traveling. At that point, I had accumulated almost 7 million miles in Delta Airlines. I was a flying colonel. I was a million miler. I was a platinum 1 zillion, whatever it was. They actually came out to my office once and gave me a plaque. Honest to God, I'm not making this up. They gave me a plaque, Delta Airlines. And so I was trying to fly home on the day before Thanksgiving, which is the worst travel day of the year. I mean, it's just absolutely the most insane travel day of the year. And I was coming back from the West Coast, and this absolutely terrible snowstorm had slammed the country from the Rockies all the way to New York City. And to get back to Atlanta, I had to change planes in Cincinnati, which for Delta frequent flyers, you all know, that's also known as hell, the Cincinnati airport, and because you always have to go through there. And so my plane arrived 2 hours late, and I'd missed my connection, as had pretty much everybody else. And the airport had people sleeping on the floors, and you've seen these things on TV. Some of you have lived through it. And because I was a zillion frequent flyer, miler, or whatever, you get all these upgrades, and I'd flown in on this wild, crazy, bumpy, stormy ride in first class, also known as the home of the never empty wine glass. And I was smiling a lot, even in the face of all this. And I went to the Delta Crown Room, their frequent flyer lounge, and I walked in, and the place was just slammed. I mean, it was just and there was the woman behind the desk who was taking, could rebook your flights and things. She had like 15 people standing in line, and I went in, and there was in the middle of the room, and there was chairs everywhere. It was full, and there was a TV with a football game on it, and there was one empty chair in front of it. It was the one chair where if you wanted to watch the football game, you'd have to turn your head 180 degrees, and nobody had taken that chair yet. And there was a couple of chairs around that, and then there was a coffee table, and then there was a long sofa opposite it, and then there was other, little seating arrangements all around the room. So I sat down in that one empty chair, and with the TV over my head, and right across from me on the sofa, in the middle of the couch, is this guy like out of central casting as the Texan. You know, he's got the big silver belt buckle and the lizard skin boots, and his feet are up, you know, with the belt, with the boot cut jeans, and his feet are up on the glass top coffee table, and he's leaning back there and he's smoking this giant cigar. Now, this was back in the days when they had smoking areas in airports and in frequent flyer clubs, but this wasn't the smoking area. This was the non-smoking area. The smoking area was way over there. And, in fact, when you walk in, there's a sign that says no pipe or cigar smoking, and cigarette smoking only allowed in restricted areas, you know. So anyhow, I'm sitting there, and I'm noticing what's going on. And after 4 or 5 minutes, this woman who was sitting 3 people away from him, just off to his left, just went into this coughing fit, just lost it. I mean, had an asthma attack. In fact, that's literally what happened. She started just coughing like crazy and finally caught her breath and said to him, "Sir, I have asthma and your cigar is triggering an asthma attack on me and it hurts. And would you please put it out or move to the smoking area where they've got exhaust vents, you know, to get the smoke out?" And, I mean, he looked at her like as if he was asking why she had distracted him from his football game, you know, like how dare she, and took a puff on his cigar, you know, and just blew smoke in her direction and went back looking at the football at the game, which was right over my head. So I'm noticing this going on, as is everybody else now. She gets up, she walks over to the woman at the desk, and says, you know, whatever they said. I mean, we could imagine. And the 2 of them come back, the Delta woman in her uniform, and she's got a pack of Marlboros in her hand, and the woman who had the asthma attack. And the woman from Delta says to the guy on the couch, she says, "Sir, you know, I'm really sorry, but we don't allow pipe and cigar smoking here in the Crown Room, and but here's a pack of cigarettes for you." And she sets them down on the table there. And she says, "And if you'd like, you know, I'll walk you over to the smoking area. And in fact, I don't think there's any chairs over there, but I can probably get one out of the back room just to make sure you've got a comfortable place to sit." And he's like, "How dare you interrupt my football game?" Look on his face, you know. And he looks at her and he takes another puff on his cigar. And this time, like Cool Hand Luke or something, like some, you know, one of these movie characters, you know, where they talk through the smoke as it's coming out, you know, in the old movies. He takes his puff on the cigar and he goes, "Call a cop, lady," like that, you know. And she's momentarily horrified, and she stands there for a minute like she's trying to decide what to do, and she looks down at the pack of cigarettes on the table and just decides, "I guess that's all I can do," and walks back. She looks back, and she's got now 20 people in her line, you know, who need their seats reassigned and things, and so she goes back to her counter. And the woman with the asthma attack left. She leaves. And all of us sitting in this circle are starting to actually hate this guy. and I'm thinking, this will be an interesting experiment. I'm gonna try something, because I had been actually just teaching future pacing, and so I lean across the table. I waited for the commercial. It was 4 or 5 minutes before a commercial came on. I didn't, you know, I got it that watching football was a high value for this guy. I waited for the commercial. I leaned across the table. And I said, "I'll bet you know the answer to a question that I've wondered ever since I was a kid." And he looks at me, and everybody's looking at me like, "Oh, what's this?" And I said, "In fact, I'll bet," and now future pacing is, you know, throwing a person into the future. I said, "In fact, I'll bet that for the rest of your life, everywhere you go, anytime anybody sees you, they'll immediately, the first thing that they'll think of is, I'll bet he knows the answer." He said, "Oh. You know, I've got his curiosity, but he's still not responding." I said, "In fact, I'll bet, you know, even up till now, you know, everybody who's met you has figured that you know the answer. And you know, I'd love to know, you know, because I'm sure that you know the answer." And he was like, "Okay, what's the question?" Or something like, "Okay, what's the question, kid?" And I said, "Well, you know, and I just really wanted to deepen this trance state, you know. I said, well, as you know, probably most of the people in the room around here, certainly all the people sitting in the circle. I mean, you know, we all in high school, everybody pretty much studied some little bit of psychology. I mean, you just can't get away from it, and so probably everybody you meet, you know, you know, walking down the street, you know, next week, next month, next year, wherever you go, anybody, you know, will remember from psychology class that Sigmund Freud, back in 1898, said, the bigger the cigar, the smaller the penis. And I'm just wondering, is that true? And he's looking at his cigar, and he's looking at my forehead, and I'm thinking, damn, I shouldn't have had that third glass of wine on that flight in. And after a long minute or so, he finally just stood up, and I thought he was coming to get me. I mean, I really did. And I'm leaning back in the chair trying to figure out what am I going to do, where are the exits. He stood up, stood there for a minute, just for a moment, and then just walked out with the cigar hidden like this. And the room broke into applause, you know, at least my little circle of it, you know. Yeah, so it was an okay thing, I guess, yeah. I still, you know, it's like, I still have visions of this guy. But my rationale is I probably helped him quit smoking, you know, and saved a few people from asthma attacks. So that's future pacing. It's a technique that is used a lot in political advertising. In fact, it's used, frankly, more in political advertising than in most other forms of advertising. And there's several chapters in the book that break out ads and describe how it's used and how it can be used. But it can also be used in debate. It can also be used in conversation. It can be used around the water cooler, you know, over the dinner table, whatever. One technique. Another technique is to speak the language of the person to whom you're conversing, with whom you're conversing. And there are two dimensions to this. One is to understand their referential, what are called referential frames. Really, it's a fancy way of saying understand their stories, understand their reality. And I'll give you an example of this, the particularly poignant one. In the course of my ongoing studies over the years, I studied for many years, the better part of 25 years, on and off in various places and venues, a subset of psychology that's also used in marketing called neurolinguistic programming, or NLP. And some of you are probably familiar with that. Richard Bandler was my final teacher in NLP. I got my NLP trainer's training from Richard. Richard wrote the foreword to one of my books, Healing ADD, a book about using NLP with kids to deal with the trauma of having ADD in our public school system. And Louise and I were in this class, my wife and I were in this class, this was 20 years ago or so when we were living in Atlanta. And we've been married 35 years as of last Sunday, so we'd been married about 15 years. And we were in a class this was just a basic NLP practitioner course. And the guy teaching it was a fellow by the name of Leif Roland. He's a psychologist in Atlanta, runs the NLP Center of Atlanta. And his teacher was a woman who was taught by Richard Bandler. And so anyhow, in the middle of this class, and there's, you know, a bunch of us there, and he's talking about these referential frames, and he turns to me and he says, Tom, how do you know when you know, that is, what's the trigger that says now, that you know, that is with some certainty, that Louise loves you? How do you know when you know that Louise loves you? And I said, well, when she touches me. I mean, that's just the way I'm wired all my life, you know. And we can do psychobabble all day long. It's because my mother hugged me a lot, or because she didn't hug me enough. She actually hugged me a lot. Who knows? I don't know. But if Louise gives me a hug, or just literally, I could be sitting working and she just walks by and puts her hand on my shoulder, I get goosebumps. I mean, I just feel loved. And so I said, you know, when she touches me. And so then he turns to Louise. And he says, Louise, how do you know when you know that Tom loves you? And I'm waiting for her to say, oh, when he hugs me, when he touches me, when he kisses me, when he tells me he loves me, because these are the things that I did all the time, because that's what I wanted, right? That's what made me feel loved. And she says, when he has coffee with me in the morning and we talk about the day. Now, I hate coffee. And for 15 years, I've been trying to figure out, you know, why is she always demanding that I have coffee with her in the morning? Because in the morning, I wake up and I'm fresh and I want to get in front of a typewriter and I want to write. And that's when things come to me in the middle of the night when I'm sleeping and I'm ready to go. And Louise is like, aren't you going to have coffee with me? And I'm like, no, I got to write this down. You know, it's only going to take 3 hours. And why is she so upset? And I said, you're kidding. And she said, no, that's how I know that. And I tell this story with her permission, by the way. And it's in the book. And I said, she says, no, that's how I know that you love me, because you sit and have coffee with me. That's when I feel most loved. And I said, well, what about when I hug you? What about when I kiss you? I mean, what about, and she's like, well, that's all nice, but I know you love me when you'll sit and have coffee with me in the morning and talk about the day. And, again, we could do psychobabble. She grew up in a family where the only time her dad was the assistant attorney general for the state of Michigan. He was gone a lot. He was, working, and the only time the family was all together was breakfast, and they all had coffee together. Who knows? I mean, but that's her way of knowing that she's loved. So we made a deal. I'll have coffee with her every morning, and we'll talk if she'll touch me more. Right? If she'll just walk by and touch me. I mean, we're not talking about anything kinky here. And it transformed our marriage. I mean, it's just a wonderful, wonderful thing. So then we went home, over the next few weeks, we asked our kids, how do you know that we love you? And our oldest said, I know that you love me when let's see if I can remember. Yeah, she said, I know you love me when you tell me that you love me. She said, when you actually explicitly tell me that you love me, that makes me feel loved. Our son, our middle child, for years and years, he would, Saturday morning, Sunday morning, I'd be trying to sleep in, and he'd come into the bedroom, and he'd be pulling on my foot, trying to wake me up. I mean, 5, 6, 7 years old, 8, 9, 10 years old, 11, 12, 13, 14 years old, trying to wake me up on weekends and saying, let's go to Waffle House. We live down in Atlanta, down in the South, and Waffle House is this, kind of horrid Southern institution. The $2.50 breakfast, cheese grits and scrambled eggs and raisin toast, which I've actually grown to have a great affection for. And anyhow, he'd wake me, and he'd say, come on, Dad, take me out to breakfast. And I always figured it was some sort of weird competition with his sisters. That it was like he wanted to be special. And I used to push back on it. I'd do it occasionally, but, I thought, this is, I don't want to make your sisters feel bad, and so it's just, so anyhow, now he's 18, 19 years old at the time we were asking him this question. He's 27 now. Or however old he was a teenager. And so we asked Justin, how do you know that we love you? And he said, when you go out in the morning and have breakfast with me alone. It's like, when we sit together, just you and me, just, Dad and me or just Mom and me. And we talk. He said, that's when I know that you really love me. I said, what about when I hug you? Oh, that's nice, but have breakfast with me. And our youngest, the one who, when she was 13, came home from junior high school after a whole bizarre incident that had to do with Newt Gingrich's campaign, and told us that she was never going back to school again, and that we were going to homeschool her, and that was our choice, and we did actually. We ultimately ended up homeschooling our youngest. I just have to tell you this story. It's really fast, and it's just amazing. We lived in Newt Gingrich's district, which is kind of this white bread northern Atlanta suburb. It's kind of an upscale suburb, and Newt was running as the education speaker of the House. He was running for re-election, and he was all about education. And so the word came down in the school system. All the kids, they have to, look like they're really industrious between the class, because you never know, the TV cameras might show up because all this proposed educational stuff. And so they said, the kids can't talk to each other between classes. They've got to just go to class, from and to and from class in this middle school. So in rebellion, the kids started hugging each other. Well, kids who are 12, 13 years old, 11, 12, 13 years old, middle school, they tend more often to hug people of the same gender than the opposite gender, and Newt was also running on an anti-gay platform. So this totally flipped them out, and they didn't know what to do with it. So they started busting the kids for hugging each other. And so my daughter organized a hug-in. And we get called into the school, her and like 10 other kids, and they're seriously talking about punishing these kids for hugging, and it's like, Louise and I are like, this is the most ridiculous, Anyhow, so we asked, that's the story. Anyhow, we asked our youngest, how do you know that we love you? And she says, when you teach me things. And she's the one who, since she was 5 years old, wanted to grow up to be a scientist, and right now she's studying science. And she's the one, in college, and she's the one who was always asking the questions. All of kids ask a million questions, but she was the one who was always there, always persistent, always wanting to learn. And so there's two messages here to this little story. The first is, we're all people and we all have relationships. We all have friendships. Ask your friends, how do you know that I'm your friend? What's the thing that I do that makes you feel like a friend? Ask your loved ones, what's the thing that makes you do that makes you feel like you're loved by me? And then do that, right? Because that's a useful thing. And secondly, in the political context, our politicians need to hear from us what it is that they can do to make us feel like we live in the democracy that they're supposed to be representing. Right? We need to model a behavior for them. We need to specify what we want done. And ideally, that's how this country was established. That's how it was set up. But there's several orders of frame in that, and how that can all be used. And I talk about that in the book. So anyhow, this is speaking their language. That's one way of speaking the other person's language, knowing what their language is in the first place. And very often, all you have to do is ask. Louise and I have been married 15 years, and I'd never asked that question. And when I finally did, at life's prompting, I was shocked by the answer. So ask. And number two, people have primary representational systems, primary ways that they experience the world, primary ways that they know things, that they understand things. About 70%, and these three primary ways are visual, auditory, and kinesthetic. About 70% of people, more or less, in our culture know the world through sight, through the visual sense. They see things and they know. They visualize things to understand them or remember them. And they will reveal this through their use of language, and their use of language is highly visual. They will say things like, yeah, I see what you're talking about. That's clear to me. Oh, yeah, that's crystal clear. They'll say, well, my wife, for example, she's very, very visual. I'm very auditory, which I think is why I love doing radio, and she's very visual. And so she'll say things like, you see what I'm talking about? And I'll say, no, I can't see your words, but I did hear what you said. Well, but no, I want you to be clear about this. I want to know that you see what I said. I didn't see what you said, but I do understand what you said. No, but you have to see what I'm talking about. And I mean, we've actually had that conversation. It's like, and finally I've learned to say, yes, Louise, I see what you're talking about, even though I have no idea what it looks like. I mean, I don't say that part. So anyhow, visual people will use that kind of language, and even talking on the phone, they'll say, I'll see you later. Well, you can't see me now. We're talking on the phone. What do you mean I'll see you later? But they'll say, I'll see you later. Auditory people live in a sea of sound. They mostly know the world through sound. They know the world through story. They know the world through words. They know the world through sound. And so they will say things, their predicates reveal this, they will say things like, yeah, I like the sound of that. I understand that story. The storyline of that thing makes perfect sense to me. Now I understand, the story. I'm getting redundant here. They'll say things like, great to hear from you. Hey, it's great hearing your voice. I'll talk to you soon. I'll talk to you later. These are the things that they'll say on the phone. Kinesthetic people who experience the world through their feelings, which is 5, 10, 15% of us, a relative minority of us, primarily experience the world through their physical senses. They have to know things in their body in order to know them. Kinesthetic people who are highly kinesthetic, like our son, for example, very often really struggle in school because they have to do something in order to know it. One of the presidential candidates is a classic example of this. I encourage you the next time you're watching a Democratic debate to watch Bill Richardson. He is one of the most kinesthetic human beings I've ever seen in my entire life. You watch as a question is being asked of him, his face and his whole body are going like that, like this as the question is being asked, because he's organizing stuff in his body. And when he talks, it's entirely in kinesthetic metaphor. Feels to me like they're piling up on Hillary, right? I mean, that's entirely, physical metaphor. I was in Albuquerque, New Mexico last weekend, talking I'm on a radio station there and doing a book signing. And one of the people in the audience who is active in Democratic politics says, I talked about Bill Richardson and being very kinesthetic, and he said, yeah, he's, around here he's kind of known as the groper, and I don't mean that in a sexual way. It's just that, people who work with him, here in the Democratic Party, I mean, you get within 3 feet of him, he's got his hand on your shoulder, on your arm, he can't talk to you without touching you. And so, some people are put off by it, other people feel very comfortable with it. But, so anyhow, kinesthetic people know the world through their feelings, and they will say things like, I like the feeling of that. I get a good solid sense of that. That's a good strong idea. There's standing tall, right? I mean, George Bush is very kinesthetic, by the way, and he uses a lot of kinesthetic metaphor. And one of the reasons why kinesthetic metaphor and kinesthetic language is so powerful in politics, even though a small minority of us actually experience the world kinesthetically, is because only 7% of political decision-making is based on facts. Seriously. 93% is based on what people usually refer to as the gut, as their emotions, as their sense. People make irrational decisions. Actually, what we find is that when you look at these irrational decision-making processes and the outcome of them over time, they're highly rational. In other words, there's a whole bunch of stuff going on below the level of consciousness, but it's being acted out in the body. It's being experienced in the body. So this is one of the reasons why it's so important. And highly kinesthetic people will say things like, yes, I get that. Great to stay in touch. Catch you later. Stay in touch. That kind of thing. So the carry-home message for this, what I'm doing is giving you pieces out of the toolkit that is this book. The carry-home message for this is when you're talking one-on-one with another person, listen carefully to the predicates that they use. They will typically, within 2 or 3 sentences, give away whether they're primarily visual, auditory, or kinesthetic. They will show it to you, you will hear it, you'll get a sense for it by simply listening to their language. If they're talking primarily in visual metaphor, try talking back to them in visual metaphor, even if that's not your primary representational sense. If they're talking in auditory metaphor, talk back to them in auditory metaphor. If they're talking in kinesthetic metaphor, hand them back their information kinesthetically, using kinesthetic language. And what will happen is they will have the experience of you understanding them that they didn't have before. Now, it doesn't change whether you do understand them or not. I'm assuming that you do. I mean, this is, we're hoping for, communication in a context that works here. So, and the other part of that is if you're speaking to a large group of people, or to more than 2 people, 2 or more people for that matter, whether it's around the water cooler, whether it's in the media, radio, television, something like that, whether it's standing up in city council or when your congressman comes to town and for a town hall meeting or whatever, and you're standing up asking a question, anytime you want to communicate with more than just 1 or 2 or 3 people, try to frame the language that you're using in ways that are visual, auditory, and kinesthetic. Jack Kennedy did this brilliantly in his first inaugural address, and there's a number of examples of it in the book. And I'm radically paraphrasing here. I'm condensing several sentences down into one and paraphrasing. But those of you who are old enough will remember this, where he talked about how, and he went from visual to auditory to kinesthetic in this process. He talked about John Winthrop, the Pilgrim father, as it were, in 1640 came to the United States. And Reagan later borrowed Kennedy's language. He never gave Kennedy credit for it, but Kennedy gave Winthrop credit for it at least. Kennedy said, as John Winthrop said, we are that city on the hill that the entire world is looking at. We are that beacon of liberty that the world looks to. The world is telling itself the story of the liberty of the United States. It's telling itself the story of the democracy of the United States, and people all around the world want that democracy for themselves. They want freedom for themselves. We hold this torch and we must pass it to them. We must give this freedom to them. This is one of our sacred trusts, to create a world at peace where everybody can see the true nature of America, has the story of freedom, and can hold the gifts of freedom, as I recall, words to that effect. As I said, I'm mangling it, but that was essential. And now that I've sensitized you to it, I'm assuming that those of you who are visual in particular saw it, and those of you who are auditory heard what I had to say, and those of you who are kinesthetic got it, right? So here we are, all together. So whenever you can do that, whenever you can communicate in a multimodal way, whenever you have an opportunity to show people things, tell people stories, and give them information in one sentence, like I am in this sentence right here, go for it. Use that as often as possible. Finally, motivation strategies. I want to just talk briefly about motivation strategies. This is another chapter in the book. It's not another tool in the toolkit. And motivation strategies have to do with how we internally motivate ourselves as well as how we motivate other people. What is it that causes people to do things? Excuse me. And you can elicit a person's motivation strategy very often simply by asking them, although most people don't realize that they have motivation strategies for everything that they do. But there are two primary motivation strategies. One is moving toward pleasure, and the other is moving away from pain. And we're all the time doing one or the other. We're either trying to get pleasure or avoid pain. And so when I was writing this book, this is the first book that I wrote on the air. I would outline a chapter, and then I'd go on the air and I'd riff about it for a while, and then we'd get some callers involved, and we'd talk about it on the air, and then we'd take a transcript and we clean up the transcript, and that's how the book got written. It was an interesting process. It turned out to be, I thought it was going to be really cool and really easy and really fast and only take 6 weeks. It took a year and a half, and it was an enormous amount of work on the weekends because rewriting the spoken word into the written word is mind-boggling. But I had some good help from Joellen Green Kaiser, who was a great editor as well. But in any case, I was talking about motivational strategies on the air one day, and I said, I'd like callers to call in, and in fact, Lauren Kirshner, who screens our calls, is standing back by the pillar there. Hi, Lauren, and to call in and say hi to Lauren, and thanks so much for showing up and for doing such a great job on my show. And you remember this well, I'm sure. I hope you don't mind my pointing you out. Okay. And you know, I said, if you have a really hard time waking up in the morning, call up. And if you have a really easy time in the morning, call up and let Lauren know, you know, what it's like. And we got this guy who went through like 3 different alarm clocks, you know, and each one had a snooze button, you know, 3 to 5 minute snooze cycles. And so it's like 45 minutes to get up, you know, and he hit the first clock, you know, 5 minutes later, hit it again, the second clock, and the third clock, and 45 minutes later he's waking up. So I figured that this guy probably was using a negative motivation strategy to wake himself up, a moving away from pain motivation strategy. Now, moving away from pain, if you think of it as a force of nature, is like lightning. You know, it's wham, it's hot. It's like putting your hand on a stove. Whoa, you can't touch that. It's like whipping a horse if you're trying to make it go faster. Well, if you whip a horse, it will go faster. And if you whip it harder, it'll go faster still. And if you keep whipping it, eventually it'll fall over dead. Right? So moving away from pain motivation strategies are self-limiting. You reach a point where there's so much pain that they start breaking down. And when you find somebody who has a dysfunctional motivation strategy, like having to go through 3 alarm clocks over a 45-minute period to wake out of bed, you know that you've got a moving away from pain dysfunctional motivation strategy. So I said to him, you know, what do you think about when you wake up in the morning? And he said, well, I think about, you know, the traffic jams and stuff that I'm going to have to deal with. Now, I figured, okay, for 3 alarm clocks with 5 or whatever it is, 15, you know, all these, 3 times 5, 3 times 9 cycles, this guy's thinking about more than just the traffic. You know, this has to be a compounded over time negative, you know, moving away from pain motivation strategy. So I said, then what do you think about? And he said, well, then I think about, you know, showing up late at work because I got stuck in the traffic jam, you know, and my boss is yelling at me and he's angry. And I said, and then what do you think about? And he says, well, and then I think about, you know, I'm fired and I'm standing in the unemployment line and I'm embarrassed and I'm feeling miserable and I can't get a job. I said, and then what are you thinking about? And he's like, well, and then my unemployment checks run out and I'm being evicted from my apartment and I've got all my stuff in these plastic bags in a cart that I stole from the Kroger store. And I said, and then what are you thinking about? He says, and then I'm living under the bridge, and this guy comes along and sees me there, and he just beats the crap out of me. He just you know, beats me up, and I'm laying there. I got 2 or 3 broken ribs, and I'm bleeding. And I said, and then? And he says, and then I get out of bed. Right? And it's like, I mean, you can just imagine this guy staggering out of bed every morning. Oh! So then we had this woman on who says, not only do I have no problem getting up in the morning, but I wake up 5 minutes before the alarm goes off. You know, just predictably, 5 minutes before the alarm goes off. So I said, well, what do you think about in the morning as you're waking up? And she said, well, I think about the people at work that I'm going to see that I like, you know, that I'm looking forward to having conversations with. I'm thinking about what I'm going to have for lunch. I'm thinking about the parts of my work that I enjoy, that are challenges that I'm looking forward to. And I said, do you have traffic that you have to deal with, traffic jam? And she's like, yeah, I got about a 40-minute commute. She was in L.A., I think. And so I get the guy on the phone. We've got them both on at the same time. And say, you know, do you have a commute? And he's like, you know, how long is your commute? And he's like, oh, 20, 25 minutes. And I said, you know, do you have people at work that you don't like? And she says, oh, yeah, there's people I don't like. I says, what about your boss? And she says, yeah, he could be an SOB. But, you know, I get along. So I say to the guy, do you have people at work that you do like? And he's like, oh, yeah, there's people I really enjoy. You know, there's people I look forward to seeing. And I said, you know, and your boss? Well, he's okay. You know, he's not an unreasonable guy. And so, and then I said to him, do you enjoy parts of your work? And he's like, yeah, there's some parts of my work I really do enjoy. And there's parts I don't. And I said to her, are there parts of your job that you don't like? And she said, of course there's parts of my job I don't like. So here we have two people who have roughly the same life situations, but because they're using completely different motivation strategies, she's moving herself toward pleasure, he's moving himself away from pain to get out of bed in the morning, they're having completely different outcomes as a result of this. So I said to him, why don't you steal her motivation strategy? You know, just borrow it. Start thinking about, you know, before you go to bed, practice it. Before you go to bed, think about what you're looking forward to the next day. And when you wake up in the morning, think about what you're looking forward to that day. And he says, okay, I'll try that. And he called back, but it was about a week later, wasn't it? Maybe 10 days later, he calls back and he says, you know, I've been using that motivation strategy and it works. I'm waking up before the alarm clock. I don't have to go through all these alarms and all this stuff. And so anyway, the point is that we have these motivation strategies. Motivation strategies are very powerful things. The most powerful form of motivation strategy is one that incorporates both moving away from pain and moving toward pleasure. And most, you know, for example, Social Security. We don't want to end up destitute in our old age. We do want to have enough of a social safety net that in our old age we can be at the very least comfortable. I mean, there's both dimensions to this. And you can take pretty much any political issue and frame it with both, moving away from pain and moving toward pleasure. And typically the order is moving away from pain followed by moving toward pleasure. Moving toward pleasure, if it's a force of nature, is like gravity. It's gentle, it's the weakest. Gravity is the weakest of all the forces. Pleasure is much weaker than pain. Touching a stove will move your hand much faster than, you know, thinking about smelling a flower, for example. And yet, moving toward pleasure strategies over time have the greatest power. They have the greatest force. John Kennedy was the master of moving toward pleasure strategies. Ronald Reagan was the master of moving toward pleasure strategies. We remember them for that. We revere them for that, to the extent that any of us can revere Reagan. Or on the other side of the aisle, people can revere Kennedy. I mean, you know, but nonetheless, they held up these visions. They told stories. They held out a future that we all wanted. You know, there was that moving toward pleasure component of it was huge. And of course, they were not unwilling to stand up to the bullies of the world, whether it was the Cuban Missile Crisis or whether it was Gorbachev. The moving away from pain, the one caveat that I put on all of this is, and particularly to sensitize you politically, is that because moving away from pain is so powerful and it can shock so much, if it is used and the echo doesn't last very long, and you know it fades away relatively quickly. This is why they have to keep amping 9/11, and it still doesn't quite have the power that it had the first year, and the second year, and the third year doesn't have the power that it had the second year, and every year, because we're healing slowly from it, and we're looking toward positive futures now more than we're afraid of that painful past. And yet, just before the 2004 election, you know, the week before the 2004 election, because if he had done it 2 or 3 weeks earlier, it wouldn't have worked. And if he'd done it 2 or 3 days in, he would have been ridiculed, which is the way, by the way, to puncture this kind of a strategy, is to ridicule it. It's the only effective way to do so. But a week out, so that he couldn't be accused of just, you know, pandering to the election, Dick Cheney came out with his famous, you know, if you vote for the Democrats, terrorists are going to hit us again. And, you know, and everybody was like, oh, you know, and the Democrats just didn't know how to deal with it, you know, and of course, you know, they should have made fun of him, and they should have framed it. They should have said, oh, he's the little boy who cries wolf. You know, there's this ready-made frame. Everybody instantly understands, and it could have been used, but it wasn't, tragically. So, nonetheless, these are motivation strategies. These are the toolkits, the pieces that I've put together in this book, some of them. This is, you know, maybe a third of them, to help you become a more competent communicator and share the message of American democracy, to show the ideals and the kind of country we have been in the past in our best moments and can be in the future in our even better moments, and to give to our future generation, to ourselves and future generations, a great and noble future and country, and hopefully an entire world at peace, both with humans and all other life, a world that works for all, as they say. And in that context, I would just finally add that This is your vision. This is your story. This is your torch to carry as much as mine. Every significant social change in the history of this country has come from the bottom up. It's come from the people up. It has come from the people like you and me speaking out. It's never the president or the Supreme Court waking up one morning saying, oh, gee, I think I'll abolish slavery. No, that's not how it works. It's always from the bottom up. And so it's our work we have to do. So tag, you're it. Thanks a lot. We have a wireless mic here, and for about 15 minutes, I'd be glad to take questions. John has the mic, and if you want to just hold up your hand, he'll bring it to you. And here's a person here so that it can be picked up by the C-SPAN cameras. And by the way, hi to C-SPAN and our Book TV viewers. We're very honored to be on C-SPAN and on Book TV today.
So my question is, how then do you think that applies to global warming and the way the environmental movement communicates about that? Because it seems to me that predominantly the message that's coming is the getting away from pain.
Right.
And there's not a lot of the moving towards pleasure, which it seems to me that needs to shift. And I wonder how you think about that.
One of the most brilliant politicians on this issue is Bernie Sanders. Bernie Sanders is a senator from Vermont. He's not a Democrat or Republican. He's an independent. And for 5 years now, every Friday, Bernie's been on my show. And he's the only politician I know who will, for an entire hour, take unscreened, unscripted call. He has no idea who's going to be next on the phone. He's in Vermont. I'm looking at the call screen software. Lauren's answering the phone. He has no clue. One after another, calls from all over the country on any topic, and people take him to task, whatever. He's just fine with it. I mean, I've never met. It's so the opposite of several of the presidential candidates who have told us that the only circumstances under which they'll come on our program is if they provide the questions and if I ask no follow-ups, and I'm unwilling to do that. So they're just not showing up on my show. But in any case, Bernie's answer to this, and he's been talking about it almost every week for the last year. He's really into it. Is he'll start out by going, this global warming. I mean, look at what's happening now. We had another ice thing that just fell off someplace, and another community that's falling into the muck someplace, and more methane and all this. But if we can get this new technology, if we can move away from fossil fuels, if we can figure out ways to pull the carbon out of the atmosphere and use that as energy, and we can capture sunlight, we can build an economy in this country that'll make the dot-com boom look like it was nothing. We can have something better than the Industrial Revolution. We can transform the world. We can radically reduce the footprint of humans on the world, and we can make this a world that's better for the people, for the plants, for the animals, for everybody. We just have to get started. And there you go. From moving away from pain to moving toward pleasure, from visual to auditory to kinesthetic all together. And that's pretty much Bernie's pitch verbatim. I mean, if you listen to the program regularly, you've heard him say it over and over again. And so that's what I would suggest. And Al Gore is talking more and more about the positive future aspects of it. But the reality is there's a reason why little kids' first word is no, typically. And that is because sometimes when the world is dangerous, you need to impose moving away from pain strategies and not worry about the moving toward pleasure stuff right now because there's pain so close. So we yell at our kids, don't run out in the street, don't put your hand on the stove, don't eat that dirt, things like that. And this is a time that we need to be talking about the moving away from pain part of it. But I agree with you, the moving toward pleasure part of it has to be a big one. John? Or actually, I'll let John make the decisions here. Because he's... Yes, sir.
I think all of us have experienced or are experiencing the frustration and anger and resentment and rage of the status quo in terms of what's happening vis-a-vis George Bush and the Republicans and the conservatives, what they're doing to the environment and to us. Okay, so that's a painful situation.
Let's be honest. The Democrats are not idle participants in this either.
Exactly right. They're complicitous. My take on your...
all of us.
Right. My take on this is that the conservatives are basically acting out of fear, and that liberals, in the ideal sense, are motivated what I would like to think of as the politics of love. And I think that whenever we allow ourselves, as progressives or liberals or whatever word you want to use, whenever we allow ourselves to become, to feel embittered and angry and fearful of the future that they are going to impose on us, we fall into their trap.
Sure.
And we project images. We empower them.
Is there a question in there?
Yeah, the question is, what can we do when we see that happening to reverse it, to come to the more positive, loving, positive vision? There you go.
Identify it. The most powerful way to break up a frame is to point it out, is to make it obvious. To say, it sounds to me, if you want to be real auditory about it, or it looks to me like, it sounds to me like you're just trying to make us afraid. And I'm sorry, I'm not going to be afraid. Franklin Roosevelt, when he said the only thing we have to fear is fear itself, that was 1934. He wasn't talking about Hitler. He was talking about the Great Depression. He was, literally, he was declaring war on fear, as it were. I mean, to mix and mangle metaphors. We need to say we're not afraid. And let me take that a step further. I get people calling into the program who are like, Nancy Pelosi, she just, caved in, and Steny Hoyer, he said, again, impeachment's off the table, and Harry Reid's giving in, and they're going off on this, and I'm just going to call their office, I gave them hell. And I encourage people to contact their elected members of Congress. I mean, we created this website, callcongress.org, which just has all the toll-free numbers we can find to call Congress, and make it easy for people. And let's do it in two parts, because poor Nancy, I mean, the reality is, Chris Matthews likes to say, and I think he's right, he likes to say, the Republicans want a leader, the Democrats want a meeting. Well, it's because conservatives want rule by a small meritocracy, because they don't trust the masses, the rabble, and liberals want rule by the largest majority possible, because they do trust the rabble and they don't trust the small meritocracy. And so the Republican Party is pretty much marching in lockstep. The Democratic Party is a coalition of coalitions. Nancy Pelosi is trying to herd cats. I mean, that's the bottom line. And so when we call her, and not just to pick on her, but, for example, when you call your member of Congress, your congressman or man or woman, how about calling up and saying, I disagree with that vote that you just did, and I don't think that you should have taken impeachment off the table. And I want to tell you that I've got your back. I'm here with you. You don't have to be afraid of these people anymore. I'll show up. You tell me where to be. You want me with a sign out in front of somebody's office? I'll be there. You want me to show up at the Democratic Party meeting? I'll be there. You want me to show up at the Republican Party? I'll be there. You want me to show up in Congress? I'll be there. You want me to call 10 of my friends? I will do it. I will get people out on the streets. I will have people making calls. We have your back. You don't have to be afraid anymore, Nancy. We're here with you. Don't agree with your vote, but we're here with you. And by combining those two strategies, I know we'll be much, and I know a few politicians, we will be far more effective than if we just slap around all the time. Because I'm telling you, the Democratic Party right now is suffering from collective battered wife syndrome. And we don't want to be continuing it anymore. So, John.
In your speech right now, you, as many people do who have access to the media, praised Ronald Reagan. I think the deification of that worthless piece of garbage who destroyed this country is one of the worst things that the media has done. This man did not have the courage to take on Gorbachev. The Soviet Union fell because of its own dysfunction 3 years after Ronald Reagan left office. The deification of this man who declared war...
If I may interrupt you, you are saying my radio show. And people here in this audience who listen to my radio show regularly, I only said that he was a brilliant communicator who talked in terms of positive futures, and then I added the caveat. Some of us have a problem with that. Yeah, well,
the deification of Ronald Reagan, who was a bigot and destroyed this country.
I absolutely agree with you.
Is horrible because
I wrote an entire book about how bad Ronald Reagan is. It's called "Screwed: The Undeclared War Against the Middle Class." I encourage you to read it. I thank you for your passion. And I'm saying you're preaching to the converted here. You really are. And I honor it. I truly honor it. Yeah. We have to go with the microphones. I'm sorry. No, you're welcome to come up and ask about Ron Paul, but do it in the appropriate. Yeah. Hi. Yeah. It's
okay. I'm going to bring up that Ronald Reagan issue again, but in a different context. The shining city on a hill that he was talking about.
Well, that's the line that he stole from Kennedy without giving
right.
credit.
Whereas with Kennedy, he was talking about a shining city on a hill that, we can hand off to others. It seemed like Ronald Reagan's concept of a shining city on a hill was one that we could bask in the admiration of.
It was the Cinderella castle. It was the Prince's castle, and we're all the Cinderellas out here in the boondocks.
And the differentiation, you were talking before about conservatives versus liberals, where conservatives think people are bad, liberals think people are good. To me, it seems more like it's conservatives are always thinking about me as opposed to liberals thinking about we, whereas conservatives, will, just want to make sure that they're taken care of or that things are taken care of for them to take, to hand off, to have their own, as opposed to liberals who see a better world only when the world around them is, equally satisfied.
There are two quick points to that point, and thank you, very well said. Toward the end of his movie, Sicko, Michael Moore makes this brilliant point. He turns to the camera, and I'm doing this from memory, and it's been a while since I saw the movie, but I'm pretty sure it's accurate paraphrasing. He said, ultimately, the question is, do we want to live in a we society or a me society? And that really is the question. And if you believe that the majority of people are evil, you wouldn't want to live in a we society, because it would be a dangerous place. It would be Hobbes's world. If you believe, and what's the choice? A me society, enlightened self-interest, the libertarian worldview. If you believe that the majority of people are good, then you would want a we society, and you'd be wary of the me society, because the people who believe in the me society are the predators. They're the ones who are, grabbing everything that they can get. So, spot on. The other point I'd make has to do with the difference between conservative and liberal morality. And again, this tracks back again to that notion of evil and good. Conservatives, by and large, define people as moral based on what they do in private. They want to know, what are you doing in your bedroom, with whom, in what position, and what were you smoking when you did it? Right? And that's how they decide whether or not you're moral. Liberals, on the other hand, adopt a morality that is historically biblical, for all the religions. I mean, every major religion of the world. It's frankly, I think it predates all religions. It's animist. It's everything, and that is, we cannot call ourselves moral people if there are hungry among us. We cannot call ourselves moral people if there are sick among us who are not being healed. We cannot call ourselves moral people if there are thirsty or homeless among us. We cannot call ourselves moral people if there are people in prison unjustly or who are not being visited and treated appropriately. That's liberal morality. And the conservatives look at that and think that's weak and wishy-washy, and that's, and we look at conservative morality and think that's rigid and strange. But it comes out of these fundamental different worldviews. So thanks for bringing it up. It's an interesting riff.
Hi, Thom.
Hi.
This Thanksgiving holiday, I'm planning to meet with a few friends to start our own emailing campaign that I hope will take, like a spark, fire up, and hopefully to email people not in all the states, wherever you have friends. And I want to include your techniques that I've heard tonight, as well as two of my other heroes, Gandhi and Howard Zinn.
Mm-hmm.
Always their messages, while Gandhi dealt with untenable circumstances, but he said, among many things, if you're a minority of one, the truth is the truth. And Howard Zinn always reminds us that we forget that we're in the majority, as you say so often. We forget. We really have the power, but we're, by communications or whatever, we hold ourselves back, in a sense. So I was wondering, when I put together this email, because I will, I want to email all those people who represent me, as well as people on the Judiciary Committee and all of that. I don't want to be negative, and I don't want to shame people, because that doesn't work. But I do ask the question, is democracy worth 10 minutes a week to you?
Yeah.
Yeah. To send a few emails, to make a couple of calls, big deal. And I have to get off my own butt and do it.
That's a great question, and I think that's, the best advice for contacting a member of Congress is keep it to one issue, keep it short, keep it to just, no more than 3 or 4 sentences, and really that's the best advice for contacting anybody. So if you're going to send a note out to your friends, I would Yeah, I would argue for succinctness and being multimodal. You know, try to get some auditory, some kinesthetic, and some visual components to it, into it, stories into it, things that people can see. So good luck and good on you. That's great. I'm glad you're doing that.
My question is, who would be your dream interviewee? Who would you really like to have on your show, and what would you like to have them discuss?
Well, my show is a little different from most in that it's not an interview radio show. In other words, yeah, I don't typically have people on to agree with them. Usually, I think I can do a pretty good job of talking about the issues. So probably my dream interviewee right now would be either Dick Cheney or Don Rumsfeld. I'm serious. You know, if I could really pin them down and I could get them in a situation where they actually were answering questions, because Dick Cheney and Don Rumsfeld back in '72, there's a specific reason for this. In '72, Nixon went over to the Soviet Union with Kissinger and negotiated détente. And he came back and he gave a speech and he said the era of fear is over. He was quite serious about this. I mean, Nixon was a weird, twisted, sick man, and yet also there was a very competent statesman in there on occasion that came out. I mean, Nixon, a very complicated man, and he really came. I mean, he literally came back and he said, "We've ended the Cold War. We can start amping this stuff down." I mean, this led right to the treaties that call for the abolition of all nuclear weapons. And within 6 months, the Committee for a Present Danger had been formed, and by Dick Cheney and Don Rumsfeld. And they were putting commercials on TV that said that, and they were doing the talk show circuits and doing all the lecture circuits, talking about how, no, the Soviet threat is even worse than Nixon. Nixon is naive. The Soviets have this new secret weapon of mass destruction. It's a submarine that is so sophisticated it can't be detected by our current sonar or radar. And the CIA came back in response to Cheney and Rumsfeld's. I wrote a whole op-ed piece about this. You can find it on my website with all the references and the links back to the original stories and everything. A whole historical piece on it. And Adam Curtis actually did a whole video on it in the BBC. And the CIA came back and they said, "There's no such submarine. The Soviets have no such submarine." And Rumsfeld said, "See? Told you so. They can't see it. You know, the CIA can't detect it. That's proof that it's there. They do have these weapons of mass destruction, and within a year they were able to completely undo Nixon's attempt to actually, you know, lower the fear threshold in this country. And then by that time we were full blown into Watergate, and you know, things were falling apart for Nixon anyway. Pardon? Yeah, yeah. And the Ford administration, I mean, they were big time. They basically took over the Ford administration, Cheney and Rumsfeld, as Secretary of Defense and Chief of Staff. Yeah. So those are the guys that I'd really like to take apart on the air right now, which is my fun thing. That's what I do for recreation. Yes.
Hi. I agree with the need for positive vision, including a lot of wrangling about what positive vision and a whole other level of debate and discourse about, you know, radical solutions and all kinds of discussion and ferment in that direction. But what's the relationship between that and the degree to which people, I think, are not actually fully confronting the horrors that are actually in the works, including what a potential war on Iran would mean, including the degree, you know, the level of, and what torture means, and waterboarding, and so, okay, yes. Positive vision and a lot of debate about it, but I think a huge problem is the complicity and a huge amount of idealism.
Yes.
You know, so.
I absolutely agree with you, and it's even worse than you think or than you said. The fact of the matter is that, as Naomi Wolf so brilliantly points out in her most recent book, the title of which has escaped me, but she was on the. No, not that's Naomi Klein. Naomi Wolf, the 10 Steps. What's it called? The End of America. Thank you. Yeah, The End of America. She outlines the 10 steps to fascism, and she says, you know, these are the things that every dictator does when they overthrow a democracy. It's a playbook. and every single one of those is in place. And in the past, we've come close to that. I mean, we've had 6, 8, 9 of them. Woodrow Wilson throwing Eugene Debs in prison during World War I with the Sedition Acts. John Adams in 1798 throwing Benjamin Franklin Bach, Ben Franklin's grandson, in jail with the Alien Sedition Acts. We've been close before, but in every case, back then with Adams, he was saying it was the French who were going to get us. In the case in World War I, it was the Germans who were going to get us. Well, now what Bush has said is the battlefield is everywhere. It's not limited to any one geographic place. It's all people. I mean, they're frisking 80-year-old ladies at the airports. They're taking the diapers off, 6-month-old kids looking for bombs. There is no limit to it, which means that there is no end to the possibility of this quote state of war. And as James Madison pointed out so brilliantly back in 1807, no democracy can exist in a state of continual warfare. It's simply not possible. So we have to be pointing out, and I do the best I can with my radio program, and many of my peers do as well. We have to be pointing out these very real assaults on the historic core beliefs, the core vision, the core story, and the core sense of what America is that have taken place, not just in the last 6 years, by the way. This has been building for a long time, but over the last 6 years have really exploded on the scene in a big way. We need to be pointing that out. We need to be talking about it. We need to be exposing it. We need to be challenging it, and I talk about that in some small part in the book, and in fact, that's sort of the framing device for this book. Is we need to save America. Here's a toolkit to do it, to be a better communicator to save this country. But you're absolutely right, and thank you for bringing it up. Who's John's? There we go.
I had a question about story, and you're talking about framing, and obviously lots of politicians use tools to give you a reference and to simplify things. And one of the things that I kind of feel like is happening progressively over time in our culture and probably worldwide is that we're becoming soundbite cultures where we become such effective communicators, and our winning techniques are saying things as shortly as possible and as passionately as possible at the sacrifice of truth. And it's interesting, in this book you're talking about all these tools, but none of these tools have an inherent morality to them or an inherent truth to them.
That's right.
And how do you deal in a culture that's becoming less and less able to attend to anything for more than a few moments? How do you convey truth, and how do you hold to something that may be more complicated and yet still battle against techniques that are throw in fear as quick as you can in one sentence and go.
Yeah. Great question. Two immediate thoughts come to mind. The first is that we have always been a soundbite culture. This country was founded on the phrase "Don't tread on me." No taxation without representation. We had 4-word frames that we used when the country was started. It's something that goes back, the French Revolution, the 3-word frame. You go back to the Greeks, you go back to the Roman Empire, you find the reducing of frames to a simple sentence or a simple concept, I think, is something that our brains are wired for. I think it's just how we're made. So I don't think it's so much a product of our modern culture. It's just that give me liberty or give me death. Yeah, another perfect one from Patrick Henry. So I wouldn't dismiss sound bites out of hand. The job is to come up with the elegant ones, the ones that work well, because they've always been there. There are ones out of the Bible that Jesus used. There's ones out of the Old Testament that the prophets used. From the Psalms there are sound bites and so on. So. Number one. And number two, with regard to the inherent morality of the tools, there's a chapter in the book about ecology checks. Ecology is asking, is this something that's sustainable? Is it ecological? Is this the best for everybody? Or is this simply, the ends justifying the means kinds of thing? And that's where, my thing with the guy with the cigar, it really doesn't pass the ecology test. Maybe I can rationalize it, but it's a rationalization, and I know it. We all know it. And so throughout the book, as I give examples and I talk about the tools, I keep referencing that ecology check, trying to make that trying to anchor that in my readers as part of their normal process to say, okay, if we're using the tools of communication, and this is back when I used to teach advertising, marketing, communications, and therapy for that matter, always do the ecology check, always ask, is this the right thing for this person and for the planet? And very often we never know. And very often there's the law of unintended consequences. But I think it's important that we keep that in mind and hold that as an ideal. John?
Yeah, Thom, I just want to mention this too. Now, I know this will probably never happen, but I just want to preface this anyway. Air America has on Fridays Freedom Style Friday, in which anyone can call in and say anything they want. That means that many times you get in some real madmen, that call you on the phone, and they can be callers from anything, any subject whatsoever.
Well, this isn't something that all of Air America does.
No, that's what I'm getting at. Certain broadcasters that do it on Friday, but there's a lot of them that do it on Friday. There's quite a few of them.
Mostly Lionel and me, I think.
What I'm trying to say is, I feel that Air America should challenge all those conservative radio shows to a little Freestyle Friday. And let them open it up, and let's see what happens when liberals start talking to them. We're the ones that are balanced and can do this, but they would be so terrified at the very thought of it. But I still think Air America should do it.
You're absolutely right, and here's the problem. Air America doesn't control the conservative shows. I can tell you that, there's this guy who runs this website called callingallwingnuts.com. I've had him on my show a couple of times. Yeah, and he trains people in how to get past the call screeners into conservative shows. And what's so ironic about that, because you just have to work your butt off to convince them that you're really going to suck up to the talk show host on a conservative show to get on one of these big shows. And if somebody calls my show, or somebody calls Randy's show, or somebody calls Lionel's show, or somebody, pretty much all of the shows on Air America, and they identify themselves as a conservative and they say that they want to argue a point, they go to the front of the line. I mean, I always want to put those people on the air because, first of all, it makes great radio, and secondly, it illustrates the issues. When you're wrong on the issues, though, you can't. Those folks who, in my opinion, are wrong on the issues and know that they can't defend those issues, they're not going to do it. So the best I can recommend is that, as you. That's a great one. I'll pass that along to Mark Green. That's a great suggestion. I'll see him tomorrow night at Demos. Yeah.
As a parent, I'm wondering what it is that I can do to teach my 5-year-old to participate or to be involved in a civic system that she could understand. Mm-hmm. She's inundated by Disney princesses, brats, and all that stuff that she loves, and it gives her a lot of pleasure, and she wants to be one. So how does a parent deal with something like this? It's not really taught in schools. They don't prepare them, even at a very simple level. So how do I get her interested? How do I make it exciting for her? What can we do to the school system?
Well, really what we need to do, two things come to mind. One, 5 years old is pretty young to be talking about, here's the founding principles of America. And yet it's not too young. It's really not too young. I mean, the idea of democracy, the idea of egalitarianism really is, and we'll take one last question, John, after this, and then we have to wrap it up. The idea of egalitarianism, I don't think that there's any too early age to teach that. The other is, telling the stories of history, telling the stories of what people did long ago. It's in the 1980s, as part of the Reagan's campaign to roll back the New Deal, and a purging was undertaken in our schools. And you're probably too young to remember it. I remember it well. I had kids in school in the 1980s. I was a parent at that time. And David Horowitz is continuing this now in our colleges. But they were quite successful in our high schools and junior high schools. And there was all these talk show hosts and all this stuff going around about, we've got these liberal teachers, they're union members, they're socialists, they're communists, they're teaching about, Eugene Debs and the Wobblies and the UWW and or the W, whatever it was, and Joe Hill and the history of the labor movement, and we don't want all this liberal stuff taught. And, and what came out of that was a massive purging of our schools in the 1980s, to the point where now, instead of teaching the rhetoric of early American literature, early America, and instead of teaching, which embodied and carried with it the ideals and vision and the conflict inherent in the discussions, the debates between Adams and Jefferson, for example. We don't teach any of that anymore. Instead, now we just ask kids to do is memorize dates. And, it's teaching to the test. It's the No Child Left Behind syndrome. And it's gotten on steroids in the last 10 years. But it really started in the 80s with the purging of the schools by the Horowitz types. And now it's carrying on in our colleges. And I would argue that we all need to be pushing back on that. We need to be calling for teaching critical thinking skills in our schools rather than memorization. We need to be calling for civics classes in our schools again that are more than simply memorizing dates. And we need to be calling for literacy, good literacy in the context of American history exactly constitutional history. Well, the principles of the Constitution, and to do that. And there are tools to do that. There are ways to do that. But get active with your local school board. And if enough of us do that, if enough of us start driving this stuff from the bottom up, it can happen. And of course, you can do it at home. Last question. John's got the mic. There we go.
How complicit?
You need to talk right into the mic.
How complicit do you think in continuing the seemingly charm and charisma of Reagan? And in a sense, continuing his ideology. And I have one more thing to say. Isn't there a huge contradiction in your saying that Republicans and liberals have the same vision? Because there are so many contradictions that would defy that.
Yeah. I think in terms of how government should be organized, there are clear distinctions and contradictions between how conservatives and liberals, or for that matter, Republicans and Democrats, view this nation and how it should be. I agree with you on that. And that I lay out in my book, Screwed, in great detail, and in some detail in this book as well, in Cracking the Code. With regard to Bill Clinton, what I found interesting just watching, and I have no inside track on this, I don't know Bill Clinton, but I've read you read the histories and you talk to enough people, and I was paying attention in the election of '92. And Bill Clinton ran as a liberal Democrat. He ran as a progressive. And he ran on a very progressive platform. And the story that I've heard, and I have every reason to believe it's true because I've heard it from people who have great credibility, and one of them told it on our program, and I'm trying to remember who it was that about 2 weeks before he was inaugurated, Alan Greenspan and Robert Rubin sat Bill Clinton down and said, "Bill, good job. Nice platform. Now we're going to tell you the facts of life." And, within a year, Clinton was echoing the Reagan meme when he said, "The era of big government is over." And, in fact, there was a great article about this in either the Nation or the Atlantic just in the last 6 months, that kind of laid all this stuff out. And, in fact, it was probably the author of that article who I'm thinking of that I had on the show. I think that Bill Clinton, he's an enigma to me, frankly. I introduced him in Seattle about a year and a half ago. He did a fundraiser for Jim McDermott and spent some time with him backstage before introducing him for this fundraiser. And he's one of the most charismatic people I've ever met in my entire life. I mean, you meet him and you feel like you're the most important person in the world. There's nobody else who exists for those moments when you're there. And when he's talking to an audience, he absolutely is holding them in his hands. I mean, every word is, every picture he paints, he's a brilliant communicator. And yet he's the guy who brought us NAFTA and the World Trade Organization and decimating welfare and is signing the Telecommunications Act of '96 and. I would say that on the scale of presidents, Bill Clinton was more conservative than Dwight Eisenhower. Dwight Eisenhower was a liberal Republican for whom I frankly have a lot of respect, and I wish Clinton had been at least as progressive as Dwight Eisenhower, the Republican, was. I make the joke, Bill Clinton was the best Republican president we had in the last 30 years. But I'm very ambivalent about him. And
solved the deficit and Reagan created it.
She says, except that Clinton solved the deficit and Reagan created the deficit. And yeah, I agree. I mean, there are some things that Clinton did that absolutely, that he certainly deserves credit for. That's why I said I'm ambivalent about it. So anyway, it's a tough one. Thanks so much for coming out tonight. I appreciate it very much.